The story begins in an age that sparkled on the surface but hummed with hunger underneath, a time Americans later called the Gilded Age. The word gilded didn't mean golden. It meant something thinly covered in gold. Beautiful at first glance, but hiding something raw and restless beneath. In the final decades of the 19th century, America was changing faster than anyone could quite believe. Railroads stitched the coasts together like steel veins. Oil turned men into kings. Factories glowed all night long. Cities grew, money multiplied, and people dreamed of reaching heights that once belonged only to old European nobility. This was the dawn of the millionaires. Men like Vanderbilt, Carnegie, and Astor ruled the skyline with mansions that looked like palaces. They had marble staircases, gold chandeliers, and dining rooms long enough to hold 100 guests. To many, they looked like royalty. But to Europe's old aristocrats, they were just merchants, men who had bought fortune instead of inheriting it. And that, in those days, made all the difference. For the first time, America was rich beyond measure, but not respected. Old money families from England and France looked down on the Americans who made their wealth in railroads, steel, and oil. They called them vulgar. They said their hands smelled of business. So, while these new millionaires could buy diamonds, they couldn't buy dignity. Not yet. But behind every powerful man, there were women, clever, ambitious, and quietly determined to change that. The wives of the Gilded Age weren't content to be rich. They wanted recognition. They wanted to be seen, respected, admired. And so began one of history's strangest and most glittering exchanges, a trade between American money and European titles. Every mansion in New York, Newport, and Boston seemed to echo with the same dream. The mothers of wealthy daughters whispered to one another over tea and champagne, "Wouldn't she make a perfect duchess?" Their daughters, dressed in silks imported from Paris, practiced how to curtsy, how to speak softly, how to seem not too eager. Everything, from posture to laughter, was rehearsed for a stage far away across the Atlantic. America had the wealth, but Europe had the class. And in that strange equation, love rarely had a place. What followed would become one of the most fascinating and quietly tragic chapters in social history. An era when daughters became bridges, connecting two worlds that didn't quite belong together. Still, in the glow of that first glittering decade, everything seemed possible. On Fifth Avenue, new mansions rose each year, built with ambition and marble. Grand balls shimmered beneath electric lights, a new invention that made guests gasp. Men wore diamonds in their cufflinks, and women wore jewels that once belonged to queens. Servants lined the halls, orchestras played until dawn, and champagne never ran dry. But behind the laughter, there was pressure. A quiet but constant ticking sound beneath all that glitter, the kind that came from knowing that money, no matter how much, could not buy entry into the oldest, most exclusive rooms of Europe. To walk through the doors of those ancient castles, one needed a title, a name that carried centuries of history. And so those mothers began to make plans. In New York, a few daring families led the way. The Astors, the Vanderbilts, the Whitneys. Their names filled the newspapers. People watched them closely, copying their fashion, their parties, their manners. But even they knew that true respect still lay an ocean away. So they looked across the Atlantic, where many European aristocrats, though noble in blood, had run out of money. Their castles were crumbling. Their debts were growing. Their lands no longer brought in what they once did. It was a perfect arrangement waiting to happen. The old world needed money. The new world wanted class. And somewhere between those desires, a new kind of transaction began. It started slowly, almost like a rumor. An American heiress named Jenny Jerome married Lord Randolph Churchill, an English nobleman with charm, rank, and terrible finances. Their match stunned both sides. Americans whispered that she'd bought herself a title. The British whispered that he'd sold one. But when she gave birth to Winston Churchill, one of history's most famous leaders, even the critics fell silent. Suddenly, everyone wanted a good marriage like Jenny's. Soon, ships were sailing full of hopeful daughters and ambitious mothers, their trunks stuffed with gowns, jewels, and letters of introduction. The newspapers began to call them dollar princesses. Some found fairy tales, others found heartbreak, but all of them became part of a quiet movement that reshaped not just families, but the meaning of power itself. Back in America, the glitter kept spreading. The rich built their summer homes in Newport, vast estates by the sea designed to look like French chateaux and Italian villas. Their dinners became spectacles, their parties the stuff of legend. And through it all, they spoke endlessly of Europe, of Paris fashion, of English society, of dukes and lords and the possibility of something greater. It was ambition draped in satin, and everyone wanted a piece of it. Yet, beneath the sparkle, the pressure never stopped. A daughter who failed to marry well wasn't just unlucky. She was a wasted opportunity, a chance at social immortality gone. As the 19th century faded into the 20th, the Atlantic became a bridge of dreams and desperation. On one side, America's new rich, eager for acceptance. On the other, Europe's old nobility, hungry for wealth. And somewhere in between, sailing back and forth across that restless ocean, were the young women who would pay the price for both. It was an age of glitter and gold, yes, but also of quiet sacrifice. Because beneath the music and laughter of the Gilded Age, something more human stirred, the fear of being forgotten and the longing to belong. And that's where our story truly begins. Not in a palace, but in that fragile space between dreams and duty, between love and status, between gold and the heart. To understand the strange dance between American ambition and European tradition, you first have to imagine two worlds, glittering and powerful, but built on completely different foundations. In Europe, the aristocracy had ruled for centuries. Their names were carved into history, their estates passed down through endless generations. To be born into that world meant carrying a legacy, a sense of superiority so deeply ingrained it wasn't even spoken aloud. It simply was. Their wealth didn't come from business or labor, but from land, from ancient titles, ancestral manners, and the unshakable belief that bloodlines mattered more than bank accounts. In America, though, everything was new. The country itself was still young, raw, and bursting with possibility. There were no dukes or viscounts, no royal courts or inherited estates. Power belonged to those bold enough to chase it. And so, a new kind of aristocracy began to rise. Not one of birth, but of industry. Men who started with nothing built empires out of steel, oil, railroads, and shipping. They worked like machines, calculating, investing, building cities, and reshaping the very idea of wealth. These were men who didn't inherit castles. They built skyscrapers. But no matter how high they climbed, there was something that money couldn't buy: legitimacy. Across the Atlantic, European nobles watched this new American wealth with both fascination and disdain. They admired the riches but sneered at the origins. To them, these Americans were loud, brash, and unsophisticated. People who dressed too brightly, spoke too loudly, and flaunted fortunes without the restraint that real nobility demanded. And yet, beneath that disdain was envy. The old European estates were crumbling under the weight of tradition and debt. Taxes, wars, and changing times had drained their coffers. Many noble families lived in grand homes they could barely afford to heat. Their silverware was polished, but their bank accounts were empty. Meanwhile, across the ocean, America was booming. Railroads stretched farther every year, and factories churned out unimaginable wealth. It was said that in New York alone, there were more millionaires than in all of Europe combined. The world was changing, and the aristocrats knew it. So when whispers began to spread that some of these American families were willing to trade their money for titles, ears began to perk up in both worlds. The Americans saw a chance to climb the final rung of the social ladder. The Europeans saw salvation, a way to save their estates and maintain their lifestyles. It was, in a way, a perfect exchange. But beneath the surface, it wasn't always polite. Old money and new money spoke different languages. In European drawing rooms, breeding and manners mattered more than wealth. You could be poor, but if your family had a title, you were still someone. In America, though, wealth was the ultimate proof of success. It didn't matter who your ancestors were. What mattered was what you had achieved. That clash of values created endless tension. When wealthy Americans traveled to Europe, they tried to fit in, learning how to curtsy properly, how to dine according to centuries-old etiquette, how to blend into a world that wasn't theirs. But behind their polite smiles, they often felt judged. Every move, every word, every dress was measured. There were stories of American women being snubbed at British balls, ignored by noble women who saw them as intruders. And yet, those same noble families were quick to accept American daughters when they came with large dowries. Some even joked, half bitterly, that the new titles in England were paid for by Chicago beef or Pittsburgh steel. Still, it wasn't just a matter of money or class. It was about identity. America had built itself on the idea of freedom and equality, and yet here were its wealthiest citizens desperately chasing the very kind of social hierarchy their ancestors had left behind. It was as if the glittering world of Europe had cast a spell, one that promised prestige, belonging, and history, the very things America hadn't had time to create. For the families of the Gilded Age, it became a kind of obsession. They built homes that looked like European palaces, filled them with imported marble and art, and threw grand balls that rivaled royal celebrations. Everything was designed to prove they were not just rich, but refined. But true acceptance was still out of reach. Old money, especially in Europe, had rules. You could not simply buy a family tree. So, for many American mothers, there was only one solution. If they couldn't be noble, they would marry their daughters into nobility instead. And so began a quiet exodus. Ship after ship leaving New York and Boston, filled with hopeful young women and determined mothers bound for London, Paris, and Rome. Their trunks were packed with jewels, gowns, and social ambitions. They weren't just traveling. They were hunting. The newspapers followed their stories eagerly. Names like Consuelo Vanderbilt and Mary Later became legends. These women, the so-called dollar princesses, were admired and envied. They were living proof that you could buy your way into history, though what they found on the other side wasn't always the fairy tale they imagined. Still, in those early years, it all seemed glamorous. American money was breathing life into fading European titles. Noble families restored their estates, while American mothers boasted that their daughters were duchesses. The world looked on, fascinated. But in truth, it was a fragile balance, one built not on love or respect, but on mutual need. Old money wanted to survive. New money wanted to belong. Each believed they were getting the better end of the bargain. And in between, caught in that shimmering web of ambition, were the daughters who had no real say at all. They smiled in portraits, draped in pearls and lace, standing beside men they barely knew. To the world, they looked like royalty. But in private, many felt like strangers in their own lives, torn between two worlds that both saw them as symbols rather than people. And so, the glitter of the Gilded Age began to take on a shadow. Because behind every titled marriage, every grand ball, and every glittering headline, there was always a quiet question lingering in the candlelight. Was it worth it? Before the grand marriages, before the ships that carried hopeful daughters across the ocean, there was something else, the stage on which it all began. It was called the season. A few glittering months each year when the wealthy opened their homes, their wallets, and their hearts, or at least pretended to. The social season wasn't officially written into law, but it might as well have been. Every spring, from April to July, New York, London, and Paris came alive with a rhythm of parties, operas, and endless introductions. It was the time when mothers became generals and daughters became their soldiers, trained, polished, and presented for society's approval. In New York, the season meant balls so grand they filled newspapers for weeks. Invitations were like trophies. To receive one from Mrs. Astor, the Queen of New York society, was to be crowned among the elite. But Mrs. Astor was selective. Her famous 400 list supposedly included everyone who truly mattered in New York, because, as the rumor went, that was the number of people who could fit comfortably in her ballroom. If you weren't on that list, you didn't exist. Not socially, anyway. So the wealthy did everything they could to prove they belonged. They built bigger homes, hosted larger parties, hired better orchestras. Florists were booked months in advance. Tailors and jewelers worked day and night. Every dinner, every dance, every carriage ride through Central Park was a performance. And at the center of it all were the debutantes. Young women dressed in white, symbolizing purity, stepping nervously into a world that judged them by every word and movement. Their task was simple, yet impossible. To be noticed, but not too much. To be graceful, but not bold. To seem intelligent, but never opinionated. To smile at potential suitors, but never appear desperate. It was, in essence, the art of being chosen. Across the Atlantic, London's season followed a similar pattern, but with even stricter rules. There, the highlight of a young woman's debut was being presented to the Queen. Wearing elegant white gowns and tiaras borrowed from family vaults, debutantes would curtsy before Her Majesty, a ritual that signaled their official entry into high society. It was, in a way, the original social media, but made of diamonds and whispers instead of screens and likes. Everyone watched everyone else. Who danced with whom? Who wore what? Who didn't show up? Scandal could destroy a family's reputation faster than any financial loss, and reputation in this world was everything. For mothers, the season was war disguised as celebration. Every ball, every opera, every garden party was a battlefield, a place to position their daughters near eligible men, especially those with titles. Behind every polite greeting, there was calculation. Behind every compliment, there was strategy. Some mothers even hired social secretaries, experts in etiquette and introductions, to ensure their daughters met the right people, the right duke, the right earl, the right son of a baron who might be short on money but long on prestige. It was exhausting, expensive, and often cruel, but for many families, it was their only path upward. For the daughters, life during the season was a dream wrapped in velvet and anxiety. They were admired, photographed, and praised, but also trapped. Their futures were being negotiated in the glow of chandeliers, often without their consent. They were expected to look radiant, to smile constantly, and to never show fatigue. Some of them loved the excitement, the carriages, the flowers, the new gowns from Paris. Others found it suffocating, but none could escape it. The season was destiny, and destiny was arranged one dance card at a time. And yet, beneath the glitter and grace, the season had a darker undertone. It wasn't just about love, it was about commerce. Every dance was a transaction, every smile a silent contract. Wealthy American girls brought the fortune, titled European men brought the status. Together, they created a new kind of power, one that neither world could achieve alone. Many young women grew up dreaming of this life, believing it was the highest honor to be noticed, to be invited, to be chosen. But what no one told them was that the same system that lifted them up could also crush them. A single misstep, a rumor, a scandal, a rejection, could close the doors of society forever. It was this pressure that turned some families ruthless. There are stories, whispered in old letters and diaries, of mothers who would force their daughters to attend 3 or 4 balls in a single night, changing gowns between events just to be seen, of debutantes fainting from exhaustion, only to be revived and sent back to the dance floor. And in the midst of it all, across the ocean, the Europeans watched. The British elite began to invite wealthy American families to their own seasons, curious and tempted. The Americans came armed with beauty, charm, and something the British desperately needed: money. It was in this glittering theater of manners and ambition that the two worlds began to collide. The season, meant to preserve old traditions, slowly became the bridge between them. As more and more American debutantes crossed the Atlantic, the British began to adjust their views. Perhaps these women were not so vulgar after all. Perhaps their fathers' railroads and steel companies were not so offensive when they came with million-dollar dowries. And so, the ballrooms of London and New York began to hum with the same rhythm, one of silk skirts brushing against polished floors, of laughter that masked anxiety, of candles burning too late into the night. To an outsider, it might have looked like the height of elegance, but to those living it, the season was something else entirely. A game, one that only a few could win, and where the stakes were higher than anyone dared to admit. Because behind every smile was a secret calculation, behind every dance a negotiation, and behind every glittering debutante stood a family desperate not to fall. If the social season was a battlefield, then the mothers were its generals. They might have worn lace gloves and smiled politely over tea, but beneath every silk gown beat the heart of a strategist. In the glittering world of the Gilded Age, ambition didn't always roar. Sometimes it whispered, and those whispers could change destinies. To outsiders, these women seemed born into luxury. They floated through marble halls and hosted dazzling dinners, but most of them hadn't started that way. Many came from families who had clawed their way to wealth, from shipping, steel, coal, or railroads. Their husbands built empires, but it was the wives who built reputation. They understood something the men didn't. Money could buy comfort, but not class. In the rigid world of society, class was currency. It opened doors to the right homes, the right friendships, the right marriages. And for these mothers, the ultimate proof of status wasn't another mansion or a carriage lined with velvet. It was seeing their daughters become titled ladies, duchesses, countesses, or even princesses. So they planned, with quiet precision. Every choice, from the dressmaker they hired to the guests they invited, was part of a greater design. They studied etiquette like a science, memorized who was who in every European court, and kept careful notes on eligible bachelors. They knew which British dukes were drowning in debt, which French counts had gambling problems, and which young princes might overlook the origins of an American fortune if the dowry was large enough. In the mornings they attended charity events, not out of generosity, but strategy. Being seen in the right company meant everything. In the afternoons, they hosted teas and musicales, arranging the guest list with military precision. One wrong invitation could destroy months of careful networking. They were charming, clever, and relentless. A well-timed compliment to the right hostess could lead to a dinner invitation, which could lead to a meeting with a titled bachelor, which could lead, if fortune smiled, to a proposal. Every polite conversation was a step closer to victory. It's easy now to judge them as cold or calculating, but in truth, many were trapped by the very system they played. In a world where women had little power in business or politics, social maneuvering was one of the few ways to shape their family's future. They were survivors, fighting a quiet war in corsets and pearls. Some were subtle in their methods. Others were infamous. Take Alva Vanderbilt, for example, one of the most formidable women of her age. When the old money Astors refused to acknowledge her, Alva built a mansion so magnificent that society couldn't ignore her. Then she threw a costume ball so lavish, so dazzling, that the entire city talked about it for months. Even Mrs. Astor herself had to attend. And from that night forward, the Vanderbilts were no longer outsiders. They were society. But for many women, the climb didn't end there. Having conquered New York, they set their sights across the Atlantic. The British aristocracy, with its empty coffers and dusty titles, was the perfect target. Marrying a daughter into nobility was the ultimate triumph, not just for status but for immortality. A title would outlive them all. So, these mothers crossed oceans with their daughters in tow, armed with trunks full of gowns, jewels, and introductions. They rented grand houses in London for the season, hired tutors to polish their daughters' manners, and spent fortunes on the right dressmakers. Every detail mattered: the fabric, the accent, the way one walked into a room. For the daughters, it often felt like being on display. Every dance, every dinner, every smile was a test. Behind them, their mothers watched closely, whispering encouragement or correction. A glance too bold could be scandalous. A smile too shy could be disastrous. And yet, for all the control they tried to wield, these mothers were also afraid. Afraid of failure, of ridicule, of being forgotten. Society was fickle. One season you could be the toast of every ball. The next, you might be whispered about and shunned. All it took was one rumor, one misstep, one scandal. Still, they carried on, powered by ambition and love, often tangled so tightly they could no longer tell the difference. They wanted the best for their daughters. But best often meant sacrifice. A daughter's heart was a small price to pay for the family's future. And in quiet moments when the parties ended and the guests had gone, some of these women sat alone in their gilded parlors, staring at portraits of their daughters smiling beside foreign husbands, wondering if they had done the right thing. They had won, yes. Titles, estates, recognition. But sometimes victory didn't feel like triumph. It felt like loss wrapped in lace. Yet the machine of society kept turning. For every mother who succeeded, another waited eagerly for her turn. The pattern repeated year after year, ball after ball, ship after ship. American money flowing east, European titles flowing west. The mothers became legends in their own right, architects of alliances that shaped not only families but the very idea of transatlantic power. And though they would never admit it aloud, deep down, some of them knew the truth. They had traded love for legacy. Their daughters might not thank them, but history would remember them. They were not queens, not politicians, not warriors, but they were something rarer. They were women who learned how to win in a world that gave them no real power, and through determination, charm, and calculation, they changed the very meaning of social success. As the candles burned low in their marble halls, they could finally allow themselves a small smile. Another season was ending. Another match was made, and somewhere in the distance, the quiet hum of envy rose from those still waiting their turn. The war of manners was endless, but for now, victory was sweet. For the daughters of America's new aristocracy, life was supposed to be a fairy tale. From the moment they could walk, they were trained to shine, to be graceful, well-read, perfectly mannered, and always composed. Their lives were carefully shaped like marble statues, polished, beautiful, and destined to impress. But inside those carefully arranged smiles, there were questions. Quiet, unspoken, and dangerous questions. What if they didn't want to marry a stranger? What if love meant more than a title? What if the life they were promised wasn't really theirs? No one dared to ask those questions out loud. The rules of their world were clear. A daughter's future was not her own to choose. It was something to be arranged, negotiated, and, if necessary, sacrificed. From the outside, these girls seemed blessed beyond imagination. They had jewels, gowns from Paris, music tutors, language lessons, and carriages waiting to take them anywhere. But beneath the satin and lace was pressure, a constant, silent weight pressing down on their every move. Their mothers reminded them that beauty could fade, but reputation was everything. Their fathers, busy building fortunes, rarely asked what made their daughters happy. It wasn't cruelty, it was custom. In their world, duty came first. So they learned to smile when they were tired, to laugh when they were nervous, and to charm men twice their age who spoke in accents they barely understood. They were taught how to flirt without seeming improper, how to appear demure without being dull, how to make conversation sparkle while never revealing too much. Their lives became a performance, and the stage was the ballroom. Each dance was an opportunity, a chance to be noticed, to be admired, to be chosen. The men they met were often older, their hands calloused not from work, but from generations of power. Some were polite, others were cold. Many had debts, estates on the brink of ruin, or reputations polished thin by scandal. But none of that mattered if they had titles. For these young women, the words Duke, Earl, or Lord carried more power than love ever could. Not because they didn't dream of love. They did, often and quietly. They read novels about passion and adventure, and sometimes late at night they would whisper to each other about what it might feel like to marry for something other than money. But by morning, the dream would fade, replaced by the sound of carriages and the rustle of silk, reminders of what was expected. There were exceptions, of course. Some women found genuine affection in their arranged marriages. A few even found happiness. But for many, the wedding day was the end of freedom, not the beginning of joy. Imagine a young woman standing before a mirror, her gown heavy with jewels, her veil falling like mist over her shoulders. Around her, servants bustle, friends whisper, her mother watches proudly. The room smells of flowers and perfume. She looks like a princess, every inch of her shining with perfection. But inside, her heart beats unevenly. Her hands tremble. She's marrying a man she's spoken to only a handful of times, whose touch still feels foreign, whose smile doesn't quite reach his eyes. Outside, the carriages wait, filled with guests eager to witness the match of the season. The band begins to play, and she walks forward, step by step, toward a life chosen for her. It wasn't always tragedy. Sometimes there was friendship, mutual respect, even admiration, but it was rarely romance. Letters written years later by some of these women reveal the truth behind their polished images. They wrote of homesickness, of loneliness in foreign lands, of longing for the laughter and chaos of New York or Chicago. They wrote of cold stone castles, servants who spoke in whispers, and husbands who treated them more like possessions than partners. Yet, despite the sadness that sometimes followed, they did not complain publicly. To do so would have been scandalous. Their job was to represent, to embody grace, endurance, and quiet dignity. If they suffered, they did so behind closed doors. Still, not all daughters accepted their fate so quietly. Some resisted. A few refused to marry for status, choosing instead to follow their own hearts, though that often meant exile from society. One such woman, whose name was whispered in gossip columns, ran away with a penniless artist instead of marrying a titled man her parents had chosen. Her family disowned her, but she wrote later that for the first time, she felt free. These rare acts of defiance inspired others, though most never dared follow. The walls of expectation were too high, and the cost of rebellion was too steep. But even those who obeyed began to sense the cracks in the system. As the world changed, as factories rose and women slowly gained voices in public life, the idea of marriage as a business transaction began to feel old-fashioned, even cruel. The daughters of the Gilded Age would grow up to raise daughters of their own, women who would one day demand something more. Yet in their time, they played their roles with grace. They smiled at banquets, posed for portraits, and stood beside men whose names would live in history books. And while the world saw their beauty and privilege, few noticed the quiet courage it took to endure it all. Because, in truth, it takes strength to smile when your life isn't yours, to walk toward an uncertain future wearing pearls and hope. The daughter's dilemma was not simply about love versus duty, it was about identity, about who they were allowed to be and who they had to become. And as the candlelight of the Gilded Age flickered on their faces, some must have wondered in the stillness of night what their lives might have been if they'd been born into a different world, one where they could choose. The decision to leave America was never made lightly, but once it was made, the preparations began with an almost sacred precision. The mothers packed trunks of silks and jewels, carefully selecting which gowns would impress the British nobility, which hats would flatter under the London fog, and which smiles would open the right doors. The daughters, meanwhile, stood by as seamstresses and servants scurried around them, pinning hems, brushing fabrics, and wrapping gifts for people they had never met. Every item had purpose. Every fold, every pearl, every ribbon was a message. We belong. When the day came to board the ship, the docks were alive with excitement. The air smelled of salt and smoke. Families embraced for the last time. Friends waved handkerchiefs and porters shouted over the hum of engines. Somewhere in that noisy chaos stood a young woman in her traveling dress, her gloved hands clutching the railing, her heart a storm of nerves and wonder. Behind her, America, vast, familiar, new. Ahead of her, Europe, ancient, refined, and full of ghosts. The voyage itself was both luxurious and exhausting. These were no ordinary passengers. The daughters of millionaires traveled in first class, with private suites, formal dining rooms, and orchestras playing soft music as the ocean rolled beneath them. Every evening they dressed for dinner, mingling with officers, diplomats, and other travelers who might one day become allies in their social campaigns. But even in comfort, the sea demanded patience. The voyage across the Atlantic could take a week or more, depending on the weather. Storms were common, the kind that sent waves crashing against the hull and made even the bravest passengers grip their chairs and whisper prayers. For the young women, it was a strange kind of isolation. They were surrounded by people, but alone in thought. The sea stretched endlessly around them, gray and silent, a vast mirror reflecting their doubts. Some would spend hours on deck, staring at the horizon, wondering what awaited them. Would the dukes and lords they'd heard about be charming or cold? Would they like London? Would they miss home too much to stay? Others found comfort in laughter, in gossip, in small distractions. Afternoon teas, piano recitals, or long conversations under the stars. There were moments of beauty, too, the kind that only the sea can give. Mornings when the sky glowed pink and gold, and the water shimmered like glass. Nights when the ship seemed to float through a field of stars, the moon casting silver trails over the waves. In those moments, some of the girls felt something they rarely allowed themselves to feel: freedom. For a few precious days, no one could reach them. No expectations, no gossip, no watchful mothers, just the hum of the engines and the whisper of the wind. But soon enough the reality of their journey returned. They were not crossing the ocean for adventure. They were crossing it for purpose. Every mile brought them closer to the drawing rooms and ballrooms where their futures would be decided. The newspapers loved to report on their departures. Headlines like "American Heiress Sails for London" appeared with photographs of elegant young women wrapped in furs, waving from the decks. They became symbols, ambassadors of wealth, beauty, and ambition. Everyone back home watched to see what would happen next. When the ships finally reached Europe, the passengers gathered on deck to see the faint line of land on the horizon. For some, it was thrilling. For others, terrifying. The air felt different, heavier somehow, as if history itself lingered in every gust of wind. The first glimpse of London or Paris was always breathtaking. The cities seemed ancient and endless, their buildings gray with age but alive with grandeur. The streets were narrower, the carriages older, and the people more formal. Everything felt foreign, but strangely magnetic. The American girls often found themselves caught between admiration and discomfort. They had grown up in a land of newness, wide streets, fresh ideas, and endless horizons. Here, everything was built on tradition. People spoke in codes of class and lineage, where even the smallest gesture carried meaning. At first, they were treated as curiosities. Their accents, their boldness, their laughter, it all seemed both charming and shocking to the Europeans. Some nobles found them fascinating, others found them vulgar. But all agreed on one thing: they were unlike anyone else. The girls themselves didn't always know whether to feel proud or out of place. They missed home, the warmth, the noise, the easy laughter of America. But there was also excitement in the air. Here, in these cities of history and hierarchy, their destinies were waiting. Some mothers rented grand homes in London's Mayfair or Paris's Champs-Élysées. They hosted dinners and teas, carefully inviting the right mix of nobles and socialites. The introductions began, cautious, polite, strategic. And little by little the American women began to blend into this new world. But not everything was smooth. The rules were stricter here. A lady could not simply strike up a conversation with a man. Every meeting had to be arranged, every visit approved. Gossip moved quickly, and one misstep could ruin everything. The American women, used to more freedom, often had to learn restraint, to move slowly, to speak softly, to hide their ambition behind charm. Yet, for all the challenges, there was also triumph. Many found that their confidence, their straightforwardness, was exactly what intrigued the European men. They were different, refreshingly so. They smiled more, spoke more openly, and carried themselves with an ease that centuries of tradition had nearly erased. In that difference lay their power. And so, as carriages rattled over cobblestone streets and chandeliers sparkled above candlelit banquets, the great social exchange began. Old blood meeting new money, old world meeting new dreams. Behind every curtsy and conversation, the tides of history were quietly shifting. The Atlantic no longer divided two worlds. It connected them. But for the daughters who made that crossing, the journey had only just begun. The sea was behind them, but the real storm of class, expectation, and emotion was waiting on land. And somewhere in that mix of excitement and unease, a thought whispered through more than one heart. I've come so far, but what if I never feel at home again? The first time an American heiress met a true European aristocrat, it was almost like stepping into another century. The air itself felt heavier, filled with unspoken rules and quiet power. The halls of those ancient homes, castles, manors, and sprawling estates were lined with portraits staring down from dark, gilded frames. Each face seemed to ask the same silent question. Do you belong here? The young women who had crossed the ocean came prepared for that question. They had studied the customs, practiced their curtsies, learned the difference between Your Grace and My Lord. But still, there was something unnerving about standing in front of someone whose family had been powerful for hundreds of years, whose ancestors had fought in crusades, signed royal charters, or dined with kings. Many of these noble families had seen better days. The titles remained, but the fortunes had faded. The great halls were often cold, the roofs leaking, the gardens overgrown. But pride was eternal, and it was that pride, that sense of being part of something ancient and irreplaceable, that fascinated the Americans. They had come from a world built on ambition, where success was new and loud. Here, success was quiet and inherited, and that contrast made everything feel both alien and alluring. At dinner parties and balls, the introductions began. Names were exchanged, hands were kissed, polite smiles traded. The young Americans, radiant in their gowns and jewels, stood out immediately. They spoke more freely than European girls. They laughed too loudly sometimes. They met people's eyes instead of glancing down. To the older nobles, it was shocking. To the younger ones, it was thrilling. One English earl reportedly said after meeting an American debutante, "She's the first woman I've met who looks at me as if she's thinking, and not waiting for me to speak." That spirit, that spark of confidence was something Europe hadn't seen in a long time. Still, not everyone approved. Some hostesses whispered that these American girls were too bold, that they lacked subtlety. But the whispers didn't stop the invitations from coming. Their wealth was too large to ignore, and their charm too bright to dismiss. For the young women, every social gathering was a test. The way they danced, the way they laughed, even the way they held their teacups could decide their fates. The men, though polite, often carried quiet judgments. Could a woman from a family of merchants or railroad tycoons ever truly understand the life of an English countess? Some men, particularly those with debts or fading estates, saw opportunity. A rich American wife could save their ancestral lands. Others were drawn by curiosity. These women were different, lively, full of color in a world that had grown gray. The most successful matches were built on a mix of attraction and transaction. The nobleman gained money. The American bride gained a title. But that wasn't the full story. Some of these marriages grew into partnerships, even friendships. Behind the marble facades and arranged introductions, humanity still found a way to show itself. Yet for every happy union, there were others that ended in disappointment. The cultural gap was deep, and not all could bridge it. Some brides found themselves lonely in cold, echoing estates, surrounded by servants who resented them and neighbors who barely spoke to them. Letters from those years tell of women who missed the laughter of home, the open skies of America, the sense of belonging that no title could replace. And still, the exchange continued. Ship after ship brought new faces across the sea, new daughters, new fortunes, new dreams. London society became a little more American with each passing season. French salons sparkled a bit brighter, Italian estates a bit richer. The Europeans learned to adapt too. Many nobles began to see the Americans not as outsiders, but as a necessary evolution, a blending of old and new, of heritage and hope. The daughters themselves learned just as much. They became more refined, more cautious, more strategic. They learned how to read a room, how to turn gossip into advantage, how to hold their own in a world that had never intended to make room for them. And yet, beneath the jewelry and titles, some of them still carried a quiet ache, the memory of wide American skies, of simpler laughter, of a life that might have been. For now, though, they were living history, reshaping what it meant to be powerful, to be respected, to be seen. The old world might not have expected them, but it could no longer ignore them. They had arrived. Every glittering ballroom, every sparkling gown, every diamond necklace had a story behind it. A story not of magic, but of money, pressure, and long, sleepless nights. For the American heiresses who now lived among Europe's elite, elegance wasn't just a luxury. It was survival. The moment they arrived in London or Paris, they were measured, not just by dressmakers but by society itself. Every choice mattered. The color of a gown could start a rumor. A slightly outdated style could ruin a first impression. A misplaced accessory could mark a woman as unfashionable, or worse, uncultured. To fit in, these young women had to transform, and quickly. Their mothers hired the best tailors, jewelers, and etiquette tutors money could buy. Paris became their classroom. Couturiers like Worth and Paquin, their instructors. Hours were spent standing still while fabrics were pinned, adjusted, and reshaped to perfection. The process could be exhausting. Corsets were laced until breathing became an effort. Dresses were heavy with embroidery, beads, and layers of silk that shimmered beautifully under candlelight but trapped heat and weight with every movement. Shoes pinched, jewelry sparkled but bruised the skin, and smiles had to remain effortless through it all. And yet, when they entered the ballroom, when chandeliers glowed above them and music began to play, it all seemed worth it. Heads turned. Conversations paused. They were the image of grace. Every inch a success story of transformation. The whispers that followed them now carried admiration, not doubt. But behind the beauty, the pressure only grew stronger. Fashion was a game with no finish line. There was always another event, another gown, another expectation. A lady's worth could rise or fall with a single appearance, and gossip spread faster than fire. In letters sent back home, some women admitted how tiring it all was. One wrote, "Every day I dress as if my future depends on it, because perhaps it does." They were no longer just women. They were symbols. Of new money meeting old nobility, of ambition dressed in silk, They carried not only their own reputations, but those of their entire families, and sometimes even their entire nation. Maintaining this life was expensive beyond belief. Jewelry alone could cost more than a house. A full wardrobe for a season in London or Paris could rival the price of a small business. And yet, to falter was unthinkable. The illusion of wealth had to be maintained at all costs, even when the costs were quietly unbearable. Their mothers often managed the finances from afar, negotiating with bankers, shipping trunks of new gowns, and sending letters filled with both advice and anxiety. The young women learned to smile at every gala, even when they missed home, to laugh at jokes they didn't find funny, to stand beside husbands or suitors who saw them as acquisitions more than companions. Some found solace in each other. In drawing rooms or garden walks, they shared whispered confessions about aching feet, about longing for the warmth of family, about the strange loneliness of being admired by everyone but truly known by no one. For all its beauty, elegance could feel like a cage. The more perfect they appeared, the harder it became to show their true selves. Vulnerability had no place in this world. Tears were to be hidden, desires to be softened, individuality to be polished smooth until it gleamed like marble. Still, there was pride, too. They were changing the narrative, turning the daughters of merchants and magnates into duchesses and countesses, reshaping the boundaries of what society thought possible. Some of them wore their elegance like armor, not decoration. Every gem on their neck was a declaration. I have earned this place, even if I had to buy it. And perhaps, in quiet moments before sleep, they allowed themselves to feel both, the triumph and the exhaustion, the music of the ballroom still echoing in their ears, the weight of diamonds pressing softly against their skin, and the memory of a time when they could run barefoot through the grass without worrying who was watching. That memory was fading now. In its place stood a woman sculpted by expectation, graceful and glowing, but sometimes hollow with fatigue. She smiled because she had to. She sparkled because the world demanded it. And though history would remember her for her beauty and poise, few would ever know how much strength it took to keep the illusion alive. Night after night, dance after dance, smile after smile. The price of elegance was not counted in gold or jewels, but in the quiet surrender of self. Love, in the world of the wealthy and the titled, was rarely a matter of the heart. It was a matter of timing, fortune, and negotiation. Behind every glittering ball and romantic waltz there was strategy, careful, deliberate, and sometimes ruthless. The matchmakers, both professional and unofficial, ruled this hidden empire. These were the women who moved silently through drawing rooms, taking note of every conversation, every hesitation, every stolen glance. They remembered names, fortunes, and titles as easily as others remembered faces. To them, a young woman was not just a person. She was a portfolio of assets: beauty, charm, family wealth, and potential influence. When an heiress entered a ballroom, the game began. The matchmakers watched who looked at her, who didn't, and who should. They orchestrated introductions, adjusted seating arrangements, and whispered small suggestions that seemed harmless but carried enormous weight. The daughters themselves were aware of this invisible web. They had been trained for it since childhood, to stand just so, to smile at the right moment, to speak with grace but never too much confidence. Every detail was a signal, every gesture a message. A misplaced word could close a door forever. Mothers played their own roles as unofficial diplomats, trading gossip and favors, quietly forming alliances with other families. They would write letters to friends in London, Paris, or Rome, arranging invitations to the most coveted events, ensuring their daughters were always in the right place at the right time. The men, for their part, were just as aware of the game. Many titled bachelors had grown up surrounded by similar schemes, and they played their roles with equal precision. A slow dance might be offered not out of affection, but obligation. A compliment might be a calculated move to test a woman's interest, or her family fortune. there were formalities to follow. First, an introduction, often through a mutual acquaintance. Then, a polite conversation. Never too personal, never too long. After that, if interest persisted, an invitation to a dinner or an afternoon ride. Only after weeks or months of this careful dance would anyone dare to speak of courtship. For the Americans, this world was both fascinating and frustrating. Back home, flirtation was freer, conversation more open. Here, everything was coded, wrapped in layers of etiquette and expectation. You couldn't simply say you liked someone. You had to show it through silence, through the length of a glance, through a blush caught between sentences. And yet, the thrill of it all was undeniable. The slow unfolding of attention, the uncertain dance of manners and emotion. It was like living inside a novel. But unlike novels, there was little room for true choice. Behind closed doors, parents and advisors discussed futures like business deals. Dowries were measured against debts, charm against lineage. The amount of money an American family could offer often decided everything long before affection had a chance to grow. Some girls accepted this without protest. They understood that marriage was not about happiness but about security, for their families, for their futures. Others dreamed quietly of something more. They wrote in diaries. They whispered in candlelit rooms. They watched the men who made them laugh and knew, deep down, that laughter alone would never be enough. The matchmakers, of course, preferred to ignore such dreams. Their world dealt in outcomes, not emotions. They smiled as couples danced beneath chandeliers, already calculating how the announcement might appear in the papers. But even in a system so rigid, love sometimes slipped through the cracks. There were stories, rare, almost miraculous even of a real affection blooming amid the politics. A shy glance turning into a genuine bond. A marriage arranged for convenience becoming one of companionship. The matchmakers never took credit for those. They called them fortunate accidents, though perhaps they were something more. Small rebellions of the heart. Still, most unions were practical. The American women married into titles. The European men married into money. The press called them dollar princesses, a term that glittered with irony. Their faces appeared in magazines, their stories whispered in both admiration and envy. They were successes, every one of them, at least on paper. But success in that world often came with an invisible weight. To win the game was to lose a part of yourself. To be chosen was to surrender freedom. And once the wedding vows were spoken, the matchmakers moved on, already searching for the next perfect pairing. It was a quiet kind of power, what these women wielded, unseen but absolute. They were the architects of futures, the keepers of balance between wealth and heritage. And though history rarely remembers their names, their influence shaped entire generations of high society. For the daughters who lived through it, the game was both dazzling and dangerous. They had crossed oceans to chase possibility, only to find that the real storm was not at sea, but within the glittering walls of the ballroom. And so, as music played and candlelight flickered on jewels and silk, the game went on, endlessly repeating, endlessly refined, until, at last, the waltz ended, and another name was added to the long, glittering ledger of alliances. When the moment finally came, when months of dinners, dances, and delicate negotiations ended with an engagement, it was treated like a royal announcement. Newspapers printed the couple's names, artists sketched their faces, and gossip flowed like champagne. But behind every headline that read, "An American heiress marries an English duke," lay a truth few cared to see. This wasn't just a love story. It was a transaction wrapped in white satin. For many families, these marriages were business deals with better lighting. The dowry was discussed before the vows, and the details could be shockingly specific. How much land would be saved, how many debts would be cleared, how large the settlement for the bride. Contracts were drawn, hands were shaken, and fortunes exchanged before the first note of the wedding march was ever played. And yet, when the day itself arrived, it looked like a dream. The bride stood at the center of it all, draped in lace and pearls, her face a careful picture of serenity. Church bells rang. Guests filled pews dressed in silks and jewels. The air smelled faintly of roses and candle wax. The photographers waited outside, cameras ready to capture a perfect moment, a symbol of union between the old world and the new. But for many of these brides, the ceremony felt almost unreal. They were performing a role written long before they arrived in the story. Every movement had been practiced, every smile rehearsed. Some barely knew the man waiting at the altar. Some were marrying titles rather than people, becoming duchesses, countesses, or ladies of estates whose names they still struggled to pronounce. Still, there was pride in it. Their mothers watched from the front row, eyes shining, hearts full of victory. They had done what they set out to do. They had climbed the social mountain brick by brick, lace by lace. No longer outsiders, they were part of the aristocracy now. And yet, for all the triumph, the quiet ache remained. After the music faded and the confetti settled, the carriages rolled away toward ancient homes with echoing halls and watchful eyes. Servants waited at the doors. Portraits of stern ancestors stared from the walls. The young brides stepped into lives that were beautiful but often cold. They had left behind the warmth of America, the laughter, the freedom, the sense of movement. In its place was a world of etiquette, formality, and endless scrutiny. Their husbands, though often polite, were products of their own upbringing, reserved, proud, sometimes distant. The match had been arranged for wealth, not companionship, and many couples discovered too late that admiration could not always grow into affection. There were exceptions, of course. A few couples found balance, building mutual respect and even tenderness. In quiet moments, they learned to bridge their differences, to find humor in misunderstanding, comfort in shared loneliness. Those rare marriages proved that not every bargain ended in regret. But others were not so lucky. Some brides wrote letters home filled with longing, describing cold winters in drafty manners and dinner tables where conversation never warmed beyond polite small talk. They missed the sound of trains, the smell of the sea, the way their families laughed too loudly and hugged too tightly. The newspapers, of course, never printed those stories. To the world, they were success tales. Proof that money could open any door, that ambition could conquer even the oldest traditions. Their photos were displayed proudly, their jewels admired, their names spoken in drawing rooms across Europe and America alike. It was easy to believe that these women had everything. In truth, many had traded one form of limitation for another. In America, they were rich but not accepted. In Europe, they were titled but not entirely free. And yet, through quiet endurance, they changed things. Slowly, they brought warmth into those ancient halls. Their laughter filled rooms that had long been silent. Their modern ways, their confidence, their independence, began to influence the very societies that once resisted them. Over time, the dollar princesses became something more than outsiders. They became the bridge between centuries, the living proof that even in a world built on bargains, humanity could still shine through. The weddings were only the beginning. What followed, the adjustments, the heartbreaks, the triumphs, was the real story, the one rarely written in society papers. For every bride who smiled for the cameras, there was a young woman lying awake that night in an unfamiliar bed, wondering quietly if she had made the right choice. But in that moment, under the glow of chandeliers and the hum of celebration, no one thought of doubt. The music played on, the glasses clinked, and the world applauded. A union had been made between wealth and heritage, ambition and tradition, love and duty. A bargain sealed with a kiss. The celebration had ended. The champagne had gone flat, the flowers had wilted, and the music had faded into silence. All that was left now was the echo, faint, haunting, and endless. The new brides, once surrounded by cheers and applause, found themselves in the great echoing houses of their husbands. For some, the journey itself was like stepping into another time. The carriages rolled through fog-draped countryside, past stone gates and fields that stretched forever. When the castle finally came into view, it looked like something out of a fairy tale. Towering spires, ivy crawling up ancient walls, windows glowing faintly in the dusk. But as they crossed the threshold, many felt something colder. The air inside was heavy, almost still. The fireplaces smoked more than they burned. The portraits of long-dead ancestors watched from the walls, eyes dark and disapproving. Servants moved quietly, their footsteps muffled, their gazes quick but unreadable. Everything seemed beautiful from a distance, but close up it felt lifeless. These homes, after all, were not new. They were centuries old, built for a time when comfort was a luxury and warmth was rare. The young American brides, raised in houses filled with gaslight and chatter, found themselves waking up in rooms that creaked and sighed, where drafts slipped through cracks and candles flickered in protest. The silence was the hardest part. In New York or Chicago, there was always noise, trains, carriages, laughter, conversation. Here, in the countryside of England or France, nights were quiet enough to hear the ticking of the clock, the wind brushing against the windows, the lonely call of an owl somewhere beyond the fields. Their husbands often left early in the mornings, busy with estate matters or hunting trips, leaving their new wives alone with housekeepers and expectations. Tea was served at exact hours. Letters were written on thick paper, and afternoons stretched endlessly under gray skies. The days became routine. Breakfast alone, walks through gardens that weren't truly theirs, polite conversations with visitors who spoke in coded compliments. The rhythm was precise, almost mechanical. There was no shouting, no laughter, no chaos, just the steady hum of obligation. Many brides wrote to their mothers describing the strange, quiet melancholy of their new lives. One wrote, "I am surrounded by beauty, and yet I feel more alone than I ever did before." Another confessed that she missed the smell of coffee, the bustle of the city, the sound of people who talked because they wanted to, not because they were expected to. Still, they learned. Slowly, painfully, they adapted. They studied the history of their new homes, memorized the names of servants, and learned which relatives were safe to trust. They found small ways to make the castles feel alive again, redecorating rooms, hosting gatherings, introducing laughter where it had long been absent. Sometimes the locals whispered that these American women were too loud, too free, too modern. But just as often they were admired for their energy, their determination, their refusal to fade quietly into the background. They brought warmth to cold halls, light to shadowed corners. Some even managed to win over their distant husbands. It wasn't easy. Love built on practicality rarely is. But over time, affection grew. A shared joke, a moment of kindness, a gentle touch on a cold morning. These were small things, but in a world ruled by decorum, they meant everything. Others weren't so lucky. There were marriages that remained polite but empty, partnerships held together only by duty. Those women learned to find fulfillment in other ways, through charity, art, or travel. They discovered strength in solitude and grace in endurance. And through it all, they changed Europe, not with rebellion, but with presence. They brought in new ideas, new ways of speaking, dressing, even thinking. Their laughter echoed through those old halls, unsettling some but inspiring others. The cold castles of the old world began to thaw, bit by bit, as the warmth of the new world seeped in through the cracks. Still, in quiet moments when the guests had gone and the fires burned low, many of them would walk to the windows and look out into the mist. The night would stretch endlessly before them, stars hidden behind clouds, and they would wonder if this was truly what they had dreamed of. If all the wealth, the title, the elegance had been worth the loneliness. But they stood tall nonetheless. They had crossed oceans, challenged tradition, and carved places for themselves in worlds that never intended to welcome them. And though history remembers them for their marriages, perhaps their truest legacy was their resilience. The courage to survive the silence, to keep the fire alive, even when the castle felt unbearably cold. Time, like the tide, changes everything, even the stiff traditions of high society. What began as cautious curiosity toward the American brides soon turned into something else entirely. At first, they were new money, the subjects of quiet laughter and subtle judgment. But as the years passed, they learned the language, the manner, and the rhythm of their new world. And then they changed it. It started small. A dinner conversation here, a new style of dress there. These women brought with them an energy that the old aristocracy had long forgotten. A sense of liveliness, a touch of daring. They weren't raised to be silent. Back in America, they had spoken their minds, laughed loudly, and made decisions for themselves. So, even as they adjusted to their new lives, they carried that spark with them. At first, their outspokenness shocked people. A duchess was not supposed to joke at the table, nor was she expected to have opinions about politics, books, or the way an estate should be run. But the Americans didn't always follow those rules. They smiled when corrected, and then they simply kept being themselves. Slowly, society stopped scolding and started listening. By the 1890s, American heiresses were not just marrying into the nobility. They were shaping it. Their homes became the centers of conversation. Their fashion set the trends. Their charity events filled the newspapers. Invitations to their dinners became as valuable as royal summons. One countess from New York famously redesigned her husband's ancestral home, adding electric lighting, new furniture, and even an indoor bathroom. Shocking her in-laws, but impressing everyone else. Another hosted salons where writers, artists, and musicians mingled freely with dukes and generals. They broke the barriers between proper and modern, creating a new kind of social world, still elegant but alive. The Europeans might have had titles, but the Americans brought something rarer: enthusiasm. They weren't content to sit quietly while their husbands handled everything. They wanted to contribute, to improve, to make a mark. Some began managing estates, organizing education for tenants, and even investing in new businesses. Behind closed doors, many of these women were the true decision-makers in their households. And though the press still called them dollar princesses, the name began to lose its sting. People started to see the other side of the story, the courage it took to leave home, the patience it required to earn respect in a world that didn't want to give it freely. They were no longer seen as intruders, but as pioneers of a new kind of nobility. Of course, not all of them thrived. Some continued to struggle, caught between two worlds, too American for Europe, too European for home. But even those who lived quietly changed perceptions simply by existing. They proved that refinement wasn't something you inherited, it was something you cultivated. There was irony in it all. The very families who had once looked down on them now sought their company, their approval, even their friendship. Daughters of old lords asked these American women for advice on how to dress, how to speak, how to host dinners with flair. It was a subtle but undeniable shift. The center of power was moving, and it no longer belonged entirely to tradition. Some of these women even became advisors to royalty, confidants of queens, and patrons of the arts. They helped modernize fashion, architecture, and social customs. Through sheer presence, they softened the edges of Europe's rigid class system, proving that wealth, energy, and intellect could matter just as much as bloodline. And though they might not have planned it, they became symbols of progress. Their daughters grew up speaking with perfect accents, straddling both continents with ease. Some would go on to marry for love, not title, something their mothers could only have dreamed of. When those women, the first generation of American duchesses and countesses, looked back on their lives, they often saw a strange mix of triumph and fatigue. They had achieved everything society told them they should want, but they had also fought every step to keep their individuality intact. In public, they were perfect. In private, they were strong. And though many would never admit it aloud, they had become the real queens. Not of thrones, but of influence, taste, and quiet power. The grand halls that had once been cold and lifeless were now filled with music again. The old families, once stiff with pride, found themselves laughing, dancing, and living a little more freely. That was their legacy. Not just the jewels and estates, but the change they brought simply by being themselves. In their own elegant way, they had rewritten the rules of society. For all its glamour and grace, high society was built on whispers. It lived by appearances, and it was sustained by silence. But no matter how carefully people played their roles, secrets always found their way to the surface. And for the American heiresses who had married into European nobility, scandal was both their shadow and their stage. The newspapers called them fairy tale brides, but fairy tales often have darker chapters. The moment one of them stumbled, a careless word, a forbidden friendship, a letter that never should have been written, the world pounced. Every ballroom in London, every salon in Paris buzzed with speculation. Some scandals were harmless, born from boredom. A countess seen laughing a little too warmly with a young poet. A duchess choosing to wear an American dressmaker's design instead of a Parisian one. These small rebellions filled the gossip columns, giving people something to talk about between dinner courses. But other stories carried weight. There were marriages that began to crumble, quietly at first, then loudly. Husbands who spent more time with horses or politics than with their wives. Wives who, in their loneliness, found comfort in conversation with someone they shouldn't. In those days, appearances mattered more than happiness. Divorce was unthinkable. It wasn't just a personal failure, it was a public disgrace. So many of these women lived in careful performances, smiling at galas while their hearts quietly fractured. Yet there was something defiant in the way they endured. They learned the art of concealment, the soft laughter, the graceful nod, the perfectly timed glance that said everything and nothing at once. Even heartbreak had to look beautiful. Sometimes, though, the masks slipped. Letters were intercepted, secrets overheard, and suddenly, polite society would turn on itself. Drawing rooms buzzed with whispers, fans fluttered faster. It was said that some American duchesses, still young and idealistic, underestimated just how sharp those social circles could be. One, famously, was accused of having too much spirit, of speaking her mind, of dressing too boldly, of being too American. She was never forgiven for it. The papers printed cruel things and invitations stopped coming, all because she refused to play small. But not every scandal was tragic. Some were liberating. A few women, weary of the cold marriages they had been pushed into, quietly chose freedom. They took lovers, they traveled, they built lives on their own terms. Shocking society, but inspiring others. Their names were spoken in half-whispers, but their stories survived because they dared to live. It was said that when one such woman finally returned to America, years later, she told a journalist, "I lost everything that mattered to them, but I found myself." There was beauty in that kind of defiance. It wasn't loud, it wasn't cruel. It was the quiet rebellion of women who refused to let their lives be defined entirely by others. And through it all, the gossip never stopped. Society fed on scandal like oxygen. Every ball, every dinner, every ride through Hyde Park carried with it the chance of a new story. A new name whispered behind a gloved hand. But in the end, the women endured. They smiled, they adapted, and they learned to use the whispers as armor. If they were going to be talked about, they might as well give people something worth remembering. By the turn of the century, the old aristocracy had begun to fade, and so too did the power of scandal. The world was changing. Newspapers were full of headlines about politics, invention, and the coming modern age. The whispers of high society began to sound smaller, less important. But for the women who had lived through it, those years of quiet warfare left their mark. They had learned that beneath every polished smile was a story, one of endurance, compromise, or courage. That beauty could hide pain, and grace could conceal defiance. And maybe that was the greatest scandal of all, that behind the perfection of that glittering world were real people, with real hearts, trying to survive the cages they were born or married into. As time moved on, many of their secrets faded into history. But sometimes when you look at an old black and white portrait of one of those women, standing tall in silk and pearls, you can almost sense it. A flicker of defiance in her eyes. A silent message from across the centuries. I played their game, she seems to say, but I never let it own me. The world the dollar princesses built their dreams upon did not last forever. For a while, it seemed eternal. The grand estates, the endless galas, the polished manners that wrapped every conversation like silk. But history has its own rhythm, and by the early 1900s, that rhythm began to change. It started quietly. The whispers of progress, trains that moved faster, machines that worked harder, people who dared to question the old order. The same social walls that once divided old blood from new money began to tremble. Industrial wealth wasn't shameful anymore, it was the future. And those elegant castles, filled with tapestries and dust, began to look less like symbols of greatness and more like relics. Many of the great European families found themselves struggling. The land no longer paid as it once had, taxes climbed higher, and modern life demanded more than inherited titles could provide. The very reason those men had married American heiresses, money, began to slip away again. Fortunes faded, debts grew, and some of the grandest homes were sold piece by piece, chandelier by chandelier. For the women who had once been celebrated as saviors of old dynasties, it was a strange kind of justice. They had crossed oceans to win approval, endured loneliness to preserve traditions. And now, those traditions were dissolving around them. Some of them adapted, as they always had. They sold jewels, moved to smaller homes, or returned to America, where the air felt freer and the expectations lighter. They became philanthropists, writers, and adventurers, women who no longer needed titles to define them. But others stayed, clinging to the fading glow of the world they had once fought so hard to enter. The laughter in the ballrooms grew softer. The orchestras stopped playing. The letters from across the Atlantic grew fewer. And then, in 1914, the first thunder of war rolled across Europe. Everything that had once seemed stable, the crowns, the castles, the careful elegance, shattered. Men marched away in uniforms and women traded silk gowns for nursing clothes. The war didn't just end an era, it erased it. The great houses became hospitals. The ballrooms were turned into dormitories. Those who had once danced beneath chandeliers now stood beneath flickering oil lamps, caring for the wounded. The sound of violins was replaced by the rumble of artillery far away. After the war, the world that emerged was unrecognizable. The old titles meant less, and the fortunes that once held everything together were gone. America had risen, Europe had changed, and the idea of marrying for status began to feel old-fashioned, even cruel. The surviving dollar princesses were now older, wiser, and often quietly proud. They had seen both the best and worst of that glittering age. They had played their roles beautifully, endured their trials, and now, at the twilight of that world, they stood as its final witnesses. They looked at their children, modern, educated, free-thinking, and knew the world would never ask them to sacrifice the way their mothers had. The castles might remain, the portraits might still hang on the walls, but the age of trading love for lineage had come to an end, and perhaps, deep down, many of them felt a quiet relief. For all its beauty, the gilded world had been a golden cage, and though it gleamed brightly in memory, the freedom that followed, the laughter, the choice, the right to love without calculation, was a treasure far greater than gold. Time has a way of softening everything. The scandals fade, the gossip quiets, and all that remains are the stories, the fragments of lives once lived so brightly they left traces across continents. The American heiresses who married into European nobility are gone now, their portraits gathering dust in silent galleries, their names footnotes in family histories. Yet, their influence lingers, woven gently into the fabric of the modern world. They were, in their own way, the bridge between two eras, between the old world of inherited titles and the new one built on ambition. They stepped into societies that didn't want them, endured the sting of condescension, and then transformed those very societies with their energy, wit, and strength. Today, we might call them pioneers, not explorers of land, but of identity, women who pushed the limits of what was expected. In a time when most women were told to stay silent, they negotiated marriages that altered economies, influenced politics, and shaped the look of an entire age. And beyond the jewels and estates, they left something far more lasting, the idea that a woman could be both elegant and independent, graceful and ambitious. You can see their legacy in every woman who steps into a room and refuses to shrink. In every daughter who is told she can lead, dream, or travel wherever she chooses. These women didn't have that freedom. Not fully, but they opened the doors for it to exist. It's strange, isn't it? That a story that began as a transaction, money for title, gold for acceptance, ended up being one about transformation. They went overseas to be accepted, and instead, they ended up changing the very places that had judged them. The irony of history is that the world they tried so hard to fit into no longer exists, but the world they helped create, one of opportunity and reinvention, is very much alive. Their descendants no longer need to marry for status. They inherit more than wealth, they inherit possibility. And though their ancestors' choices were often painful, there's a quiet heroism in them too, in the courage it took to leave home, to endure the unknown, to adapt in a world that often refused to understand. If you look closely at the photographs from that time, the sepia tones, the soft edges, the stillness, you can almost feel it. Beneath the corsets and pearls, behind the calm expressions, there's a heartbeat of determination. They weren't just ornaments of a golden age. They were builders, survivors, and dreamers cloaked in silk. And maybe that's what ambition really is. Not hunger for power or fame, but the quiet will to endure, to transform one's fate, to carve meaning from circumstance. These women did exactly that, in a time that gave them very few choices. As the world moved into the modern age, their stories became myth-like, romanticized, dramatized, and sometimes forgotten. But when we look back now, it's not the glamour that matters most. It's the grit, the humanity, the reminder that even in the most gilded cages, someone dared to sing. The legacy of those American heiresses is not in titles or fortunes, but in spirit, a spirit of reinvention that still runs deep in the American character, and, perhaps, in all of us. Because history isn't just about kings and wars and empires, it's about people who dared to step beyond what was expected of them. And in that quiet courage the world turns, always changing, always moving forward, one brave choice at a time.